Top diplomats from the G7 pledged to help Ukraine see through the coming winter as Russia continues its attack on civilian infrastructure.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz arrives in Beijing ahead of crucial talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
South Korea scrambles fighter jets in response to Pyongyang's recent missile tests and calls for an immediate end to provocations.
Top diplomats of the G7 gathered in Germany, vowing to help Ukraine see through the coming winter. The foreign representatives expressed concern over food shortages and the energy crisis as Russia continues its attack on civilian infrastructure.
They cannot occupy it, they cannot win in the military, in the battlefield, they cannot win the war, and they are destroying the country systematically. Millions of Ukrainians have no longer access to electricity. And what Putin is willing to do is to put the country in the darkness in the wintertime. This is a war crime.
Despite the advances of Ukrainian troops on the northeastern and southeastern fronts, a harsh winter is still expected for soldiers and civilians. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that more than 4.5 million people have lost access to electricity. But morale in the Ukrainian army is high as Kyiv's forces are preparing for a fierce battle to retake Kherson after the Russian puppet authorities of the city have renewed calls for the evacuation of civilians.
Russian forces continue to withdraw some elements from northwestern Kherson region, but it is still unclear if they will fight for Kherson city, says the Institute for the Study of War. The think tank has observed that Russian forces are continuing to prepare fallback and defensive positions on the left bank of the Dnieper River and northwest of Kherson city, while transporting additional mobilized forces there. Some Russian elite units, such as airborne forces and naval infantry, are reportedly continuing to operate on the western bank of the Dnieper River, and this remains the best indicator of Russian intentions. So while the relocation of the Kherson region occupation administration to Henichisk and Skadovsk by the Crimean border may suggest that Russian forces are preparing to abandon Kherson city, it may equally indicate that they're setting conditions for urban combat within the city. Meanwhile, in the east of Ukraine, Russian forces prematurely impaled an insufficient concentration of mobilized personnel on offensive pushes near Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Donetsk region, wasting the fresh supply of mobilized personnel on marginal gains towards operationally insignificant settlements. The Institute for the Study of War says Russian forces would likely have had more success in such offensive operations if they had waited until enough mobilized personnel had arrived to amass a force large enough to overcome Ukrainian defenses. UK's Defence Ministry also says that due to the low morale and even reluctance to fight, Russian forces have probably started deploying the so-called barrier troops or blocking units. These units threaten to shoot their own retreating soldiers in order to compel offensives and have been used in previous conflicts by Russian forces. Recently, Russian generals likely wanted their commanders to use weapons against deserters, including possibly authorizing shooting to kill such defaulters after a warning had been given. The UK Defence Ministry says the tactic of shooting deserters likely attests to the low quality, low morale and indiscipline of Russian forces.
During his visit to China, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called for changes in the economic relationship between the two countries. Scholz is the first G7 leader to visit the country since the pandemic began, and China is Germany's most important trading partner.
Allerdings müssen wir zur Kenntnis nehmen, dass der wirtschaftliche Austausch mit China in jüngerer Zeit für deutsche.
However, we must take note that the economic exchange with China has recently become more difficult for German companies. This applies to market access, which is very open from the European side, while China is closing off many sectors. This applies to the protection of intellectual property and also the disruption of economic political relations. We're also noticing that China now talks more of economic independence, whereas economic exchange used to be in the foreground, and political objectives also determine economic action. We had a very frank and detailed discussion about all this. I stressed to my host how important it is from our perspective to address the imbalances.
Ich habe gegenüber meinen Gastgebern betont, wie wichtig es aus unserer Sicht ist, die Ungleichgewichte zu beheben.
The Chinese premier was equally frank. While sharing Scholz's views on security, he also acknowledged the two countries had a different outlook on other issues. We're united in maintaining world peace and regional stability, but China and Germany have had many differences in terms of culture, history and social systems. There are naturally divergent views. We have controversies that can't be avoided. We also had quite honest exchanges on that. Ahead of meeting the Premier, Chancellor Scholz spoke with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. It's his first visit to China as German Chancellor.
Olaf Scholz is in Beijing this week in what is fast becoming a controversial trip. Scholz is the first Western leader to visit China since the pandemic began, and it comes amid pressure from within the EU to take a tougher stance on the country. But the German Chancellor is travelling with a delegation of business leaders, leading many to question his intentions behind the trip. Well, joining me now is Jonas Perello-Plesner, Executive Director of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. Great to have you with us, Jonas. Now, many countries in the EU, they are looking to wean themselves off dependence on countries like Russia, like China. Olaf Scholz instead is headed to Beijing with a delegation of business leaders. What's his aim here?
Well, when you go with a business delegation, isn't your aim to make business? And that's precisely what I also criticize, the question about, is this too much business as usual? In particular, if you take Scholz literally, he's announced that he would do a Zeitenwende in German, a sort of tide shift in German foreign policy that would be less reliant on authoritarian links, particularly Russian gas, of course, has been what has brought that to the forefront after Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And therefore, this seems a little bit to sort of continue an autopilot policy with China rather than to sort of take a bold new step.
I mean, it seems that reliance anyway for Germany is already there when it comes to import-export markets, for example, and reliance on Chinese goods. So I want to take things one step further then. Say, for example, we see China make moves on Taiwan. Where would that leave Germany when it is so reliant? What could it say in that situation when actually there is a lot to lose?
There is. So any situation where you would have a conflict, be it over Taiwan, and for example, you could see a similar situation to with Ukraine, and you would have US maybe ask Europe to step up with sanctions on China. And that would, of course, be immensely difficult for Germany in particular, because these huge dependencies have been built with the Chinese economy. And that's precisely the sort of things that Scholz has to think about, both from a risk perspective of his German businesses, but also from a broader European perspective of how do we safeguard our interest in a world where autocracies such as Russia, but also China, have shown willingness to use power, shown willingness to use economic links for to sort of make democracies vulnerable.
South Korea scrambled about 80 military aircraft, including advanced F-35 jets on Friday. The move came after tracking about 180 flights by North Korean warplanes in what appeared to be a defiant show of strength. In addition, Pyongyang has fired around 30 ballistic missiles over the past couple of days. It's a grave provocation jeopardizing peace and stability on the Korean peninsula and in the international community, and a clear violation of UN resolutions. We condemn it and urge a halt immediately. North Korea is continually flexing its military muscle, but the recent missile tests are the furthest it's gone for some time. The secretive regime claims it's responding to Vigilant Storm, a joint aerial exercise being carried out by South Korean and US forces in the region. It had been due to end Friday, but has now been extended due to the North's actions.
It's a dark day for Twitter employees as thousands brace for a wave of layoffs following Elon Musk's takeover. The billionaire, who recently paid $44 billion for the social media platform, has removed the company's board of directors and installed himself as the sole board member. Several staff members tweeted they were locked out of their work accounts on Friday morning as the cuts came into effect. Musk is reportedly looking to fire half the current workforce. But workers are fighting back, bringing a class action lawsuit against the company for failing to give adequate notice of the layoffs. For instance, in the US, employers who sack 500 or more workers are required to give at least 60 days public notice. California's Employment Development Department says it has yet to receive any such notifications from Twitter.